We're going to bring him back in the studio with our experts, Phillip Yin, U.S. labor expert, and also from Houston, TJ Walker, managing editor of the Daily National. Phillip, let's start with you. Rosa was talking about this living wage, and this is controversial, but I want you to help us define what do they mean when they say a living wage? Because there's also the minimum wage as well.
Right. Well, it's almost always higher than the minimum wage. Obviously, there wouldn't be a need for it. And the notion is that, you know, it's supposed to make sure that workers get paid sufficiently to afford life in a given city. So it takes into account the cost of living where it's being applied.
TJ, you know, when I first heard about this story, I mean, I had a lot of different thoughts, but I see both sides of it. And my question to you is, if Walmart says, okay, fine, we'll pay our employees this living wage of $12, $13 an hour, which is substantially more than the minimum wage, does this go down a very slippery slope in what government can tell companies to pay their employees?
Well, the government already tells companies what they can pay. There is a minimum wage. Here's the real problem for Walmart. They have gamed the system. They put so many of their workers on part-time status just so they don't have to pay them benefits and health care and a decent wage. Here's the reality for the taxpayer. Taxpayers, you and me, have to subsidize Walmart to the tune of $5,000 to $6,000 per employee because their employees are getting all sorts of subsidies. Medicaid, they're getting food stamps. Their children are getting subsidized lunches because they're so poor they can't eat. Meanwhile, Walmart is making half $1 trillion in revenues.
A very important debate, which is who pays for the social services for a lot of these low-wage employees? It's basically the DC government versus big companies.
It is, and a lot of governments are wising up, but it's not just the DC government, it's the federal government. We have you know, conservatives always say we should go back to the 1950s when times were better. Well, in the 1950s, if you worked for General Motors, you could support a spouse and a family and afford a mortgage and have a very nice lifestyle. And that was with a high school education. Today, with a high school education going to work for Walmart, you have to live on public assistance if you want to feed your family. Meanwhile, Walmart's revenues are nearly $500 billion. The subsidies that taxpayers are giving Walmart and the Walmart billionaire family is adding up to billions of dollars.
All right, let me bring in Phillip here.
That is socialism for the rich.
TJ brings up a good point, socialism for the rich. I don't want to necessarily go in that direction, but there's a sort of mathematical question here. If a big company wants to set up a shop and they want to hire 100 employees at the minimum wage, and you say, no, you can't pay the minimum wage, you have to pay double, for example. They say, fine, we'll pay double, but we'll only hire 50 people instead. Which is really better?
Well, I mean, first of all, a Walmart doesn't necessarily create jobs. What it does is it takes people who have existing jobs, leave it maybe, and come there. Or it puts those smaller companies out of business so you don't have a net gain in jobs. But to me, you know, I completely understand the driving force behind this. As I read about in my book, we now have the biggest gap between rich and everybody else in this country we've had since the Great Depression. That is a huge problem on many counts. So we need to do something about it. I'm not sure that governments in this level and that level intervening with this company, that company, telling them what to pay is the best way. I think there's a much better way to deal with the problem.
TJ, what is the responsibility of the federal government in this position? Can the states and cities supersede the overall minimum wage? I mean, I know individual states already set the minimum wage, but they haven't really told companies what they can exactly pay their employees. For example, you can't say, well, a senior manager should be paid X.
That's not what this proposed legislation in Washington would do. It would define it in terms of how big you are, how many employees. It doesn't, to my understanding specifically, name companies. Yes, cities and states can tell people what they want corporations to pay, but it is a problem, as we see right now. Walmart says, okay, we're just going to leave your city. This is a nationwide problem. It deserves and requires a nationwide solution. That means it has to be done at the congressional level. But if cities like Washington, D.C. or San Francisco want to get the ball rolling, that may be what starts the conversation and creates a political will in this country to change things at the federal level. So
TJ, I hate to break it to you, but here in Washington, we haven't achieved too much as of late. And Philip, you're shaking your head, and you've got a small smile as well. Is Washington, D.C., is the federal government even capable of really creating any laws, for that matter, that's going to deal with the situation, or does it ultimately go back to the local and state jurisdictions?
Neither. This is not a problem that's going to be resolved by creating artificial minimum wages. It's simply not. And even philosophically, why should a worker at a smaller company earn less for the same work than a worker at a big company? I don't think that's the solution. The solution is to have a labor movement in this country that once again is big and strong and robust enough to organize workers and negotiate good contracts like unions did in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, thereby bringing millions of Americans into the middle class. There are specific things that can be done to restore labor to the strength it needs to do that once again, and that's where the focus ought to be.
Gentlemen, Phillip Dine, U.S. labor expert here in Washington, D.C., T.J. Walker in Houston, thank you very much for your time. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.